Dead Lost. Written by Michael Pennington. Voiced by Michael Pennington. We started our hike around 11 a.m. in the Kiamichi mountain range of southeastern Oklahoma. This is a large, heavily wooded area within the Ouachita Mountains. My husband Derek of 15 years was alongside for the trip. We had the hike planned for months and we were very excited. Both of us had a backpack each filled with water and simple proteins and carbs. By noon, we decided to take our first break. We were already at least 2 miles into the mountainside. Tall pine trees were scattered everywhere, and since it was early fall, the scene was beautiful. We found a giant rock to sit on, and Derek took some pictures of me being goofy on the rock. That's when we heard the first indication we were not alone. You know, in the movies, when somebody is in the woods and hears a noise in the distance that nobody else seems to hear. Well, that was us, except we both heard it. A stick had popped, and it was kind of loud. Probably a coon jumping down from a tree, Derek said, going back to his camera, insisting on more pictures. I obliged, because I was having fun. But soon we were off again. The purpose of the hike was just for pure exercise, and we had planned on going just deep enough to be able to turn around and make it back to the car by 6 p.m. We were on a ridge when we heard the second noise. It was another popping sound. I stopped. Derek was directly behind me. There was a slight rainfall now as wind whipped through the pines. Everything had gone silent, too. "Okay," I said, giving him a glare. "Same noise, and everything just went quiet, even the birds. It's pretty creepy." He looked around thoughtfully. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "An animal can do that. Usually a large animal." My eyes grew big at this. He pointed at my backpack. "Just have your bear spray handy, just in case. That's why we packed it for." I got the bear spray out of the backpack and we carried on. Around 1:30, we stopped at a clearing for some food. We faced a huge field, which finally led into the thick underbrush and pines. Looking across this field, it must have been a mile long to the tree line. I dropped my backpack and the bear spray and took a breath. Our pace had been fast and I'd already worked up a good sweat. The sound came again, this time very close, within 20 feet. I looked behind us into the trees. A small breeze that hadn't been there a minute ago had swept through this area. The trees and brush swaying slightly with it. It was a beautiful yet haunting scene. Derek seemed alert but frustrated. He walked back into the thicket. I didn't like that idea. "Honey," I said, giving him a look, "what if it's a bear? Don't go back in there. Stay out here." And he stopped as if what I'd said had made him think. He looked concerned, but again, he was frustrated. "I think we're being stalked by a mountain lion," he said. "And if we are, it's right there in that grass we just walked through, camouflaged." "We need to go back," I said sternly. He nodded. "I agree. Unfortunately, we do need to go back, as much as I don't want to." "It's okay," I said. "We can come back another time. This is really starting to creep me out." "I know. Look, you take the lead, since something's behind us. North. Stay north. I'll stay behind and keep an eye out. It won't attack if I'm facing it. And I'll keep an eye on you too." So we started back, just slightly at an angle. We were basically walking up the tree line in which we had just came out of, avoiding the woods, trying to stay in this large open area as long as we possibly could without going back in there. About 200 yards in, I looked back over my shoulder to check on him. He was gone. My heart thumped. "Derek," I pleaded, looking around everywhere. The wind picked up and gushed harder. My skin prickled with goose flesh. I went into an immediate panic. I had not heard a scuffle of any kind that would indicate him being dragged into the woods, and he would not be playing a joke on me, especially considering the situation. I called his name again louder and got a strong rush of wind in return. A storm was brewing. Rain fell a bit harder now. I fought back tears as my worst nightmare came true. I was alone without Derek, and somebody or something was stalking me. Had an animal jumped him silently and I not heard? Dragging him into the woods only to come back for me when it ate him? The thought pretty much chilled me. I clenched my bear spray can. I stood there frozen, my eyes darting from the woods to the spot that he'd been. It was about 7 feet behind me. Then somebody stepped out of the woods. I jumped back in horror to see a man instead of an animal. He was about 6 foot tall, dressed in black from head to toe, and wore what appeared to be a cloth or polyester face shield over his face, the kind of facial gear one would wear for wind or rain protection. This covered his neck, chin, all of his face, past the bridge of his nose, and his full head, hair and all. The only part it did not cover was his eyes that were shielded with dark sunglasses. He looked very scary, and I screamed. He pulled out a knife from a compartment in his pants that was as long as my arm. My adrenaline kicked in. I cannot describe how scary that moment was, how utterly terrified I was, but somehow I found the will to move and I began to run. I don't know why, but I darted back into the trees, thinking I could lose him in the heavy underbrush. I regretted this, but didn't stop as I plowed through the brush, screaming my head off. I heard branches snap and leaves crunch behind me, and I knew he was pursuing me. If I tripped, I was done, so I slowed my pace and looked over my shoulder. He was about 15 feet behind me and didn't seem like he was too worried about me escaping. His movement was measured and careful and calculated, and he never looked at the ground. He kept his eye on me the whole time, and to this day, I don't know how he did that exactly. I focused my attention on forward movement, knowing this was going to be a race of endurance. The first to tire would lose. Bear spray still in hand, I hopped over tree trunks and avoided large limbs as I weaved my way through the mountains. Everything was a blur, yet very in the moment. My surroundings seemed unfamiliar, and I began to wonder if I'd accidentally run back the direction Derek and I had came. My suspicions were right. What I saw there in the mountains, I still have nightmares of today, and I will for the rest of my life. Much worse than the cloaked figure stepping out of the woods. 10 feet away, Derek hung from a tree, his neck broken at a terrible angle. His face was an expression of fear that I can never describe. He was hanging from rope. I couldn't move or breathe. I stood frozen until I finally found my vocal cords. I let out a scream that echoed through the mountainside. At that point, I might as well have been hysterical. Shock set in as I began to vomit and shake. Bending over, my breakfast coming up, I heard the killer approach. Dizzy, I finished getting sick and stood up, wobbly. I turned to face him. He stopped about 10 feet from me. He wasn't even breathing heavy. "How could you do this to him?" I screamed, tearing up. "I have a gun. If you come closer, I'll shoot." "Run," he said in a monotone-like voice, raising the large knife. And I ran. I knew at this point I could not outrun this man. He was very stealthy and fast. I only had one choice, that was to blind him with pepper spray and then escape. but that was a last resort should he catch me or get too close. I came to a small clearing that I didn't recognize from earlier. Across this field was another patch of woods, about 50 yards away. I stopped at the tree line and tried to get my breath. My arms and legs were shaky, I was hyperventilating, and my lips were quivering. I was not only having a panic attack, I knew I was in a bad state of actual shock. I looked back into the woods, and he was not there. I sighed a small breath of relief. Which way should I go? I didn't know which direction would lead me back to the car. I was completely lost. My stomach rolled again as the image of my husband returned. I had to get out of here. I had to live. Though I'd never be the same after what I'd saw, I'd gladly take a living in a nut house over dying. I never heard the man behind me until it was too late. He had crept up somehow in the sticks like a phantom. The next thing I remember is getting hit on the head and falling forward onto the field. I woke up in the same spot. It was dark and still raining. I walked across the field, my headache causing extreme dizziness. When I made it to the other side, I collapsed at the tree line. I didn't wake up the rest of the night. The following is a third-person point of view from the narrator describing this scene as it happened in the moment. The shadowy figure made his way through the woods deep into the morning. He would spend the night in the woods and exit sometime after 5 a.m. His flashlight shined on the lifeless, cold body of Derek as he made his way to the tree. He crouched by the trunk, stabbed his knife into the ground, and carefully placed a mason jar just under the deceased's leg. His light allowed him to do this precisely. Not bothering to take off his rain mask, the man propped up against the tree and went to sleep. The jar slowly filled with rainwater throughout the night. The next day, police would arrive at the scene to find a half-gutted, hanging Derek Nobles. The rainwater jar was gone.